So welcome to Ecosystem North. I'm Jamie Sunsbach. Each week, Ecosystem North shines a spotlight on the people and organizations that support our region's entrepreneurs, uncovering the real story of what inspires and drives them to be entrepreneurial champions. So about 7 years ago, I was fortunate enough to meet our next guest. It seems like he just suddenly popped into being in my life at the perfect time and became really one of the first supporters of the work that I was doing here in Rochester, and has remained a champion, and I've been a big fan of his as well ever since. So please welcome Frank Jaskulke, Vice President of Intelligence for Medical Alley Association.
Thank you. It's good to be here today, and I can't believe it's been 7 years that we've known each other now. It goes fast.
I know, and we'll get into that in just one second, but I wanted to find out just a little more about you. Could you tell us, where did you grow up? Are you from Minnesota originally? And just kind of get a feel of how you landed here in the position that you're currently in.
Yeah. Born in Wisconsin, just outside of Madison. Moved to Minnesota when I was 2. My mom's from here, dad's from Chicago, kind of ended up here. Grew up roughly equally between Minneapolis proper, so in the uptown area, and then kind of out in the sticks in the northern suburbs for about 10, 15 years. Went to college at the University of Minnesota. Originally wanted to go to grad school, become a professor of political science. That didn't quite work out, which turned out to really work out because I landed at the state capitol, where I got to learn about this partnership that the University of Minnesota and Mayo Clinic were doing in genomics. And from that, started to learn about this amazing healthcare industry in the state, which led to joining the association. And, fast forward 15 years later, here I am talking with you.
Awesome. Yeah, it is interesting how, things that don't work out, that's the thing you're focused the most on. For instance, I was so laser focused on becoming a forensic scientist. That's what I wanted to do in college. I was, I'd applied to the FBI over and over and over, and, eventually just got tired of applying and ended up out in Salt Lake City, Utah, which really, fostered this love for entrepreneurship. So it really is fun that, sometimes these things take a different route. That's life. And I think hopefully, as ecosystem builders, then, for the past 7 or 8 years, that's really benefited hopefully many entrepreneurs in the ecosystem as well. So,
and it just as an aside, I think it's always such an interesting thing how so many people I talked to, like stories similar to yours of like, there was a thing we wanted to do. It didn't quite work out, but that led to something else that turned out to be, really, really interesting and fulfilling and good. But if you had asked me 15, 20 years ago, and I'm sure it's the same for you, like, hey, would you want to be doing this? I wouldn't even known that was a thing.
No, not at all. It's either, I think back when I was starting my first company, it was just like, well, you're an entrepreneur, and occasionally entrepreneurs meet with each other and share some stories and look for connections. But there was never sort of a support network in place for at least me at first. But then actually, it's always fun in hindsight to realize that there probably was. I just didn't think of those individuals, whether they were mentors or others. So definitely, I think there's a lot to be said about this kind of emerging profession, and it's very, very exciting to be at the forefront of it for sure. So what excites you about entrepreneurship, and I'm sure in your case, more on the medical side of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, the thing that gets me really excited about entrepreneurship generally, and then the healthcare part of it in particular, kind of two things. One, I'm a homer. Like, I love Minnesota, and I love that there's a thing we can be best in. And healthcare really is it, right? Mayo Clinic, Medtronic, United Health Group, they were all small companies at one point and became the number one companies in their field in the world. And we're doing that again and again. Like, being part of a winning team is exciting. And then the entrepreneurship side of it, it's the energy, the focus on problem solving, and just the like making it up as you go aspect of it, that like you don't know how it's going to end up. You don't know if it's going to work out, and yet we still do it. And so the energy that entrepreneurs kind of give off, I find infectious, and it comports with the way I think. Like, I'm not a entrepreneur, and I don't know that I ever would be, but I like small business. I like controlling my own destiny to some degree, or at least feeling like I have some control over it. And so it's very motivating to work with people who they're really focused on solving a problem and like not waiting for someone else to solve it. And I feel like in ecosystem building, it's the same kind of thing, just a different application.
Well, I definitely think too that something that I think with the publication of Steve Case's book, The Third Wave, talking about how the second wave of entrepreneurship is sort of what we think about in, the Facebooks or the classical, like built in a garage or a small group of people with all these tools from the first wave that were provided to them. They were able to take those pieces and make things like social networking and some of these sort of more broad and abstract things that appeal to a lot of people. But, for all the pluses and, now I think we're increasingly seeing the minuses of social media, the things that still sit there, which I think he called, or someone called, the big hairy problems. Those are the things that are tough to solve. And when you think of healthcare, I think of healthcare right along with education as two of the big hairy problems that they're hard. And there's so many facets to them that it's just really hard to do. So when you think about investment dollars, you think about all of this other stuff, it's easier to fund something that'll have broad appeal, that could be easily assembled, doesn't take, research labs and medical device prototyping that can be very, very expensive. But that's what I think we're good at here in Minnesota, to kind of build on your point, is we're not scared of those big, heavy, hairy problems. We want to dive in, and we want to find a way to make a dent, and maybe several dents all over this issue of healthcare, and just taking basic R&D and turning it into something that saves lives, which is really what I get excited about when you think about the sort of medical industry here in Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things in education I'd put in this same bucket, where if you were just concerned about making a business that made money, whether it made a little bit or made a lot of money, there are things that'd be way easier to do. And like, every business is hard, but if you first have to like invent the science, and then you've got to figure out how to test it on, your kids or your parents or your friends, right? That is extra hard. It takes you have to believe in it more than just the potential financial return. And I find that really motivating, that you have all of these people who they work hard, they take a risk, and it's not just about building another business, but about saving people's lives or improving their lives. And I'm with you, like, education is the other huge one, where there's so much opportunity, there's so much need, but it is so hard.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, I try to look for benefits of, very terrible situations like COVID. But I think that's accelerating sort of a lot of thinking and a lot of opportunity in the educational space, as well as the healthcare space. So, I think hopefully 5-10 years from now, we're going to look back and say that was a bad time, but boy, did it really accelerate and shine a spotlight on these two massively difficult problems, and really inspire that next generation of entrepreneurs to say, you know what, we got this. Don't worry.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna do it. We're gonna figure it out. So
Yeah.
that's what I say to myself to, prevent me from staying up all night worrying about current things.
Right.
I think it's true. So in your current role in Medical Alley, can you just speak a little bit about what you're doing and
Yeah.
help us understand more of your role?
Yeah. So, I've got two primary responsibilities today. One is startup related, one is international related, and sometimes the two overlap. I'll talk about the international first because it's shorter, and then spend the bulk on the startup side. Um, Companies from around the world in healthcare want to go into the US market. We're a big market, we're a profitable market, there's lots of problems to solve. Those companies often, when they look to come to the US, they might go to Boston, to New York, to San Francisco, big well-known cities. They inevitably end up doing work with Mayo or Medtronic or United Health Group or any other of the companies here, but they do that by flying from their office in Boston instead of investing in this ecosystem. So my international work is focused on how do we get those companies to land here first so that they'll create jobs, they'll bring new technology, new ways of thinking, and infuse it into the broader ecosystem, right? A little less insular. The startup side of the work, kind of to a similar end, but focused on how do we make it easier for the startups to do their work. I think of it as I'm building infrastructure. And so within the healthcare community in Minnesota, most of the companies are small businesses. They're startups. A lot of them are pre-revenue even, because as many of the listeners might know, it can take years before you get an FDA approval or something else to be able to sell. So there's a long time where they're spending money, they're working hard, and they're not getting it back. Our board of directors back in 2018 recognized that we had a lot of the pieces to be the best healthcare innovation ecosystem in the world, but they were disconnected and they weren't optimized. By disconnected, we mean that the device community, for example, knows all the device companies, but knows nothing of the biotech or the digital health community. And the digital health community knows nothing of the biotech or the device community. And so they don't share resources, they don't help each other to make connections. There's missed opportunities, especially as we see more of biotech becoming computational, more of medical device becoming digital health companies going after FDA. The areas are getting grayer and are merging. So we've said as an association that we want to make that job easier. Every company has problems, and if those problems are the same, we could build one solution that then could be shared across the companies. And wouldn't that be better, faster, cheaper? In fact, it's what a lot of the startup companies do when they go out to solve a problem. They see a problem that lots of potential customers have, and they build a solution so that the customer doesn't have to solve it for themselves. We're doing that same thing with the startup ecosystem in the state, focused on health technology. And I'll tell you, two of the biggest problems we see are not actually hard to solve, but they're hard to sustain. So the first one is this idea of mutual support. Kind of like what you said a few minutes ago of you didn't know you sit down with other entrepreneurs and talk shop, share connections, provide mentorship, right? It happens informally, but it's within the network you have. And you're probably busy running a company, not busy trying to figure out who else is out there making random connections that may someday pay off. So we can do that work, build this big network, and then if you start a company and you need help, you make one connection and we'll help you open all the other doors up so you can go through faster. The second one that comes up quite often that's easy to solve but not easy to sustain has been connecting with potential partners, whether it's investors or customers or groups you might do like co-development with. there's this information asymmetry where like a large company that might buy your startup product or be a partner, they have a set of needs, but those needs are kind of hidden behind the corporate wall. And they say all the time they'd like to work with innovative companies, but they work in different ways. And they don't go and write a guidebook that says, here's how to work with us. The startups would like the distribution or the expertise or the capital that the large companies have, but they're really focused, they're resource constrained, they need to move rapidly. They a lot of times find out they just can't wait for how long it takes for the large company to get organized and respond. And they don't have a way of just going to the large and go, hey, we know exactly what it is you need. Here it is. Let's get going. So we've found very simply by gathering the information from both sides and sharing it, both sides are able to work more collaboratively and work faster. In both of those problems, it's not hard to solve. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, but someone's got to sustain it. It's got to be done today and tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. And a startup company, right, once they solve their problem, they got to move on to the next one. So they maybe solve that problem once, then they move on, another company comes behind them, same problem. So my job is to organize the resources and provide a sustainable way of making sure that if you start a company or someone else starts a company, that it's easier to open those doors, it's easier to partner. And then a year later, if you do it again, that it's still easy to open the doors and still easy to partner. So that's what I'm working on.
You know, I think that's really awesome. And it's very interesting. You're laser focused more on the medical community and many an ecosystem builder, that's what they're doing for, many other industries. So I think it's the right thing to do. I think starting with that, listening to the customer, listening to these businesses, whether they're giant corporations or a two-person startup.
Yep.
That's a key. And it's so funny that's what's missed by a lot of organizations. I always say it's more that tends to be more on the traditional economic development side of things, which is, sustain businesses that have been around for, decades, as well as try to take that moonshot that lures like an Amazon here for another site. And, myself and many others have always said the same thing. It's like, take 1/10 of the budget that you are willing to spend on Amazon and invest that into the future of these startups. And you will have, at least if you play the sort of venture capital game, you will have one company that is the next big corporation. And it's going to feel supported by Minnesota. It's going to feel nurtured by Minnesota. And so it's probably going to stay in Minnesota and continue to grow. Yep.
I mean, this is, I think, one of the most important things for the kind of the broad entrepreneurship support community, the economic development community, that the resources that are needed are not huge, but you do have to have resources, right? There have to be people, there has to be money, and it has to be sustained over a long enough period of time to make that impact. But we see it all over that when you do that, the impact is huge, whether it's private or public, right? I always think of what's happened in Boulder over the years, a community that is not very large, and they've become one of the top technology hubs in the world. And I think we sometimes get caught up in this idea of we have existing businesses, and if we just support them, we'll keep growing. That's important, but you should have a portfolio approach and make sure you're also creating the next thing and the next thing that could change the ecosystem or could become a massive job creator. But you have to have some portion of it that is looking at that so-called higher risk part of the pool, because the ones that hit, I think of right now, like Bright Health in the Twin Cities, it's transformative, right? You get hundreds of jobs, billions of dollars, and it attracts other people, other companies, other investors, and it becomes self-sustaining. But someone's got to light that fire to get it going.
Yep, that's the flywheel of entrepreneurship is what I
Yeah.
like to call it. So this was exemplified when I was in January. Actually, funnily enough, the last trip I've really made out of Rochester. um, I went to Silicon Slopes Tech Conference in Salt Lake
Oh
City,
yeah.
and I was in Salt Lake City early 2000s trying to grow a company, and this group of entrepreneurs, like we were talking about earlier, would come together and talk, and we all had these like half-baked ideas. And there's
Mm-hmm.
this one guy sitting in the room, and he's like, I kind of got this idea for a tech company, and it blew me away that here I am going into this conference, sitting down, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people at this
Yep.
thing, and I'm looking up, and I'm looking at this guy on stage, and I'm like, "God, that guy looks really familiar." And then I realized, oh my God, I knew that guy all those years ago, and he just sold his company to, oh my gosh, I can't even remember right now, to SAP or something like that for, it was like $2 or $3 billion.
Oh wow.
And to think, and then what did he do? He got up on stage. He said, we've had this big acquisition. Now I'm taking that money and I'm investing it into the educational future of Utah to make sure that computer programming, coding is an
Mm-hmm.
essential required step for all the kids starting in like 5th grade,
Oh
because
wow.
we are sick and tired of importing talent into our state. We need to home grow that talent here and
Yep.
start it early stage. And then he started talking about what I call the dandelion effect. When you have these big liquidity events,
Yeah.
suddenly, there's a lot of what I call paper millionaires or
Mm-hmm.
potentially even billionaires. They don't just like go on vacation. They tend
No.
to want to invest and start companies. So that starts that flywheel in motion. And I think, at least for us in Rochester, we're starting to get that moved again. I wasn't
Yep.
here early enough to understand why some of that stopped. I think it had a lot to do with the decline of IBM, because there was a
Mm-hmm.
lot of satellite sort of tech startups in the kind of early to mid 90s.
Yep.
But something changed, and I think that was the decline of IBM. And unfortunately, that stopped that cycle. The money just
Yeah.
didn't, people didn't get why you should invest in or be an angel investor, because it just didn't make sense. It felt too risky. It was easier to go buy some real estate 20 miles out of
Yep.
town, and that's probably going to give you a better return and a quicker
When
return.
and it's the tech stuff in the 80s and 90s for Minnesota, I think, is really apropos, right? The Minnesota for decades was the computing capital. Like all the silicon chips made in Silicon Valley were shipped to St. Paul and Rochester to go into the supercomputers that we were designing and building. And that created hundreds of startups and lots of wealth, right? And then all of a sudden, it was gone. It started declining, right? IBM shrunk, Cray went away, Control Data went away, Sperry, Rand, Unisys, all these companies, and the flywheel stopped. And we were fortunate that we had healthcare, right? Medical device was exploding and growing. But the thing in the back of my head with all of this work is always like, it could happen again. And if we don't plant the seeds today, when it does happen, we won't have the new things growing, the new dandelions blowing off. Like what we're doing today is as much about the next 5 years as the next 50 years.
Yep, absolutely. And that's always, I was just actually, oddly enough, thinking about that this morning. I was thinking about how, these sort of industries sort of ebb and flow. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's
Yeah.
even communities ebb and flow. I mean, I wasn't around during the 80s when, the Medtronics and different groups were kind of up and coming, but, it seemed like there was a very solid sense of community.
Mm-hmm.
And then once things start to grow, if there's not that sort of next generation of startups in that space, I think, things almost get too corporate. And that's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just to say that, that's the big leagues, right? That's where you can't just go to a meetup and tell people you're working on a really cool device,
Right.
because, that just doesn't work with corporations. I totally get that. So it's that constant renewal, and we just have to make sure that that flywheel keeps moving, keeps spawning new things. And I think we'll be fine. And then being able to branch out into other things as well. I mean, I've had so many conversations with so many companies that are consumer facing on the medical side. They're just like, we're going to sell this scale and, it's going to be great. And it's like, well, I get it. It's easier. It's, you don't have to tackle that regulatory demon.
Right.
But you're missing a massive opportunity, because I can show you, 300 clinical studies that if you just had a more finely calibrated device that people are dying for, in clinical studies all over the world. Like you just don't realize you could just make a separate product line and probably do very, very good, because you could mark that up to unbelievable amounts and probably hospitals will buy it because it just makes sense. And that's where, lovely things like NIH grant funding come in. But
right. Oh yeah.
But yeah, I just hope that, that's something that I've tried to say more and more to a lot of these consumer facing startups is, Minnesota is really a place you can go. You can learn not only from, premier medical institutions, but, from great payers as well, learning these things, learning what interests. I still remember the most interesting, when I knew that the Twin Cities were really a hub for medtech, was when I was at a sort of demo day. And this group came in and it talked about using chatbots for insurance. And I was kind of like, okay, this is where chatbots were like super new. And I was like, I don't, who's going to get interested in that? And all of a sudden this gentleman stood up in front of me and walked over afterwards and started talking with this group. And I kind of got up and I thought, well, who is this person? I thought maybe it's an investor or something like that. But it was the CEO of one of the larger insurance companies. And he basically said, this is something we're very interested in. And that's when I knew that, that this massive ecosystem that was building for years and years and years, when you can have the CEO of a giant corporation be seated in the audience, not their proxy, not their 15th person down on the totem pole. They took it upon themselves to show up because they realize and value these startups. That just kind of blew me away. And that's something that, I would hope, let's be optimistic. 3 years from now, we would see something like that in Rochester. I think that would be really exciting.
I think it's moving in that direction. And I'll just say on the chatbot piece, I kid you not, I was looking at a person's LinkedIn profile today that works at a large health insurance company. And that person described one of their projects was implementing a chatbot across their network for provider interaction. So to chat with doctors, it saved the insurance company $200 million. So yeah, it's real. I do think that attitude, though, that it's changing in a very positive way, where in part entrepreneurship has become trendy, which can be an issue, but it also means a lot of people are more receptive. Large companies working with startups is, I think, increasingly seen as a positive thing and not a distraction. And there's, I think, a growing respect on both sides for what a large corporation is capable of delivering and what an entrepreneur or a small company is capable of delivering. And that if you get the two to work together, you can make such a larger impact, especially in healthcare, where the markets are so gigantic and the distribution can be so expensive that if I'm a startup, I'm probably better served building the product, proving it's good, and then partnering with someone than trying to hire my own sales force and go direct. And that, even 2-3 years ago, I think that attitude was different in Minnesota. Has been changing, but we've all got to kind of keep positively pushing and highlighting where it works and when there's wins, so that it becomes more normative or more normal for big companies and startups to talk shop, to share information, and ultimately to work together.
Yeah, if you again, I'm referencing things we already talked about, but Steve Case's The Third Wave, his idea of startups working in partnership with large corporations. And then there's a third piece to that, and that's government.
Yep.
How do you see sort of the role of government in this sort of triad relationship between startups, corporations, and government policy?
Yeah. So set aside that, in healthcare, right, highly regulated, it's always there. But more generally, I've always been a fan of an old Abraham Lincoln quote about the role of government is to clear the forest for commerce to come through. And there's this idea that it's not government's job to build the business or to write the checks or to do the business that the startup might do, but to help create an environment in which business can happen or which commerce can happen. And so I look at things like Launch Minnesota and the work that Neil has been doing to make it easier to connect across the state, right? Minnesota is physically very large. And I think as Americans, we sometimes don't appreciate the distance aspect, right? We have the same number of people in Minnesota as Denmark, but physically we're the size of the United Kingdom. Like you could fit almost a third of Europe inside of Minnesota. That distance can make it hard to collaborate and to work together. And I think that's a really great place for government to help build some of that infrastructure that, no company could justify making it. And even for groups like, you and I, it's hard to do that. So I think of things like that, policy that encourages risk-taking or incentivizes investment. So things like the angel investor tax credit or supports for SBIR funding, right? Where there's already federal funding for high-risk endeavors, kind of America's seed fund, as they like to position it, making it easier to access those resources. And then probably the most important thing is education, right? Making sure we have a skilled workforce today, tomorrow, the day after that, which can be a challenge because, right, we're educating people today for jobs they might have in a decade or 20 years from now. But it's also probably the area where, very few private businesses have the ability to think in a 20, 30, 50-year time frame. Good government can do that. Good government, that's what they should be doing, is not thinking about tomorrow or a year from now, but 5, 10, 25, 50 years from now, how do we create an environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Although sometimes I think, governments think in terms of the next election cycle, unfortunately, but
always a challenge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, like, for people who are in entrepreneurship support organizations, this is a really, like, critical challenge and tension. How much should we ask for from the public sector? How much should we rely on it? And when is it better to just kind of figure it out on our own or figure it out as a private sector? And I don't know that there's really good answers for it. But I think it's the thing that keeps me up at night. Is like, I get asked by companies all the time, where's the state? Where's the federal government in this? It's like, well, is this the place where we want state resources or city resources? Should it be the place? Or could it be better in the private sector? And how do we know the difference?
Yep. That's tough questions. It's definitely a evolving process. And I think it changes, like I said, if we could get this like crazy flywheel just churning, maybe government's just, it's not as big of a player.
Right.
But definitely when you think of, even in terms of, taking a hard look at a lot of the regulations around drugs and medical device taxes and things like that, continuing to sort of encourage those businesses to, to let the government know when there's a policy that may be hurting the business, I think is well, no matter, from tomorrow to 20 years from now, that was something. And I've done that many times locally too. You meet with an entrepreneur and they say, where's this type of support? And I'm like, well, thank you for your input, but you really need to be the one to go to talk to the city on this stuff and get a couple people with you, right? And
right.
And do it.
So it's not just your issue.
They're tired of hearing from me. I'll say, well, I just talked to 5 people, and they're like, well, why don't you have those 5 people call me? So I try to encourage, entrepreneurs and growing businesses to at least let, definitely here on the local level. And I know at the state level, they're very, very receptive to anyone who wants to reach out. Just many times it's easier to grumble than it is to just make a phone call or shoot an email off.
Well, and I think you said a really important thing at the start of that around, like, when ecosystems are first getting going, when kind of the flywheel hasn't made a full revolution, if you will, that public support can be really critical, because it's probably too risky isn't the right phrase, but like the ecosystem isn't there, the infrastructure isn't there. It needs like a spark, which often the public sector can do. And once it gets going, it can be self-sustaining. But that first part of it is really, really hard. And that, at least in my view, is a great place, especially at a local level, where more connected to what's happening in their community to make a difference.
Yep, absolutely. Changing subjects just a tiny bit. The other thing that I've always admired about you is you were the first person that I heard this from, which is, we're not being loud enough about what we're doing in Minnesota. We need to be bolder. We need to shout more about all the great stuff that's going on, especially in sort of the medical industry.
Yeah.
So I guess the question for you is, and this is something I've struggled with forever, is why are we so reluctant to really shout from the rooftops all the great stuff that's going on in Minnesota, and how can we fix it?
Yeah, the reluctance part is a really good question, because I talk to people and companies all the time who are like, man, I wish we had more attention paid to us, or I wish we weren't flying, like things that are fundamentally marketing and PR issues. And kind of like it's easier to grumble than just make a call. I sometimes want to say, so why don't you just tell people about what you're doing? But then the response I often get back, and maybe this gets to the reluctance, is I think especially in the healthcare field, there is a lot of concern about like disclosing intellectual property or giving away the business plan. Like if you tell too many people, they might compete against you or do something about it, combined with maybe just a Midwestern cultural aversion to talking ourselves up. Do hard work, do good work, and then do more hard work and good work, right? But it almost, I sort of think in the end, almost doesn't matter why. We aren't, and it has a cost. Like the fact that we don't talk up what's going on here makes it harder to raise money, makes it harder to get customers, to hire people, to just have attention and feel good about what we're doing. Yeah,
it's been tough, and it's funny because even with the work we do here at Collider, we sort of fall into this, I don't know what it is, but suddenly you're like, you do like an annual report or something like that, and you look back and you say, oh my gosh, like we've done a lot, but it just, when you're in the middle of it, you don't think about it. And that's one thing that, we're trying to be more intentional about, is saying, you know what, we want to toot our horn, not like, blast people out of the sky with it, because we don't want to be arrogant, but we got to tell people what's going on, because at the end of the day, if we don't have the funds to survive, and we don't tell people that story to give them a compelling case for why they should partner with us, should support us financially, I mean, I'll be out carrying a cooler again, doing meetups and offering beer and pizza on my own dime, because that's how I started. But yeah, we've got to be a little bit bolder about what we do. And you know, I was again really impressed when I was in Salt Lake, like from their co-working spaces to all that. They, first of all, there's a strong partnership. Like they all get together and they say, we're doing this for the entrepreneur, but at the same time, they're showing you all the great things their organizations have done, but it's not crossing that line into sort of arrogance and patting themselves on the back. It's more factual, data driven. That's what I love. And I love when people do that. So I'm trying to figure out what that fine line is for this organization right now. And hopefully we'll figure that out.
Yeah. And I think it's right on that, like, if it's based in fact, it's not arrogant, it's not bragging, right? You're telling what happened, and we should feel proud of that, but we should also make sure people know the good things that are happening, because we need the resources. If people don't know we're doing the good works, right, it's going to be harder to get the resources to keep up the good work. So I think ultimately, if you believe in your mission, then you've got to go out and tell the story of it. And I think for the state of Minnesota, there are so many things that we do every day that are literally world changing, that are as big of an impact as anything in Silicon Valley. And we get 1/10 of the credit, and that's our fault. Like, It's not because people are ignoring us. We're not going out and earning the attention. And that, like, for me personally, it's a big part of what I do. Like, I would think the entrepreneurs are doing the really hard work of inventing the future and building a business and taking risk on their mortgage. All I've got to do is just tell one more person about this amazing thing that's happening, make one more connection, and we get closer and closer and closer to that flywheel just spinning and spinning.
Yep. Well, that's a lesson out there for anybody watching or listening. It's, if you're in this area, you know, tell people what you do. Brag a little bit, and that would be the best thing for everybody involved.
Heck yeah.
Another piece of this, something I've asked everyone, just because we're in the middle of some really difficult times on many levels as a society, is, you know, in the last 6 months, what's been a really bright spot for you? Something positive that's happened in the midst of all this craziness that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. You know, I think 2 bright spots. One bigger thing, just the way, given the pandemic, given the killing of George Floyd and the social rest with it, like, how many people have responded in an honest and earnest way. Like, they've been confronted with these big, giant challenges. And there are certainly bad actors and people that aren't holding up our values as a country. But I'm always impressed by how many people are stepping forward and are making changes in their life or at their company, or are challenging others to do the same. Like, I always think in the US, the thing we're really good at is when things get really, really, really bad, and like really bad. Until then, we kind of just stand around and every man or woman for themselves. And it feels like we're getting closer to that point where it's got bad enough that we're waking up. And this is where I think entrepreneurs, it's a really unique thing that, like, sometimes having a national response is what you want. And then sometimes what you want is a million points of light to try millions of different ways of solving the same problem. And because that's the way the US tends to approach things, I think that's why we have a more dynamic economy, more entrepreneurs than almost anywhere else. Because we have this idea of, I could do that, I've got an idea, and then people do it. So that, like, on a big level has been really positive. On a smaller, more personal level, the working from home thing, I'm cooking more. You know, like, I can make a breakfast, like instead of a bowl of cereal, I could actually make something or cook a dinner. And as a result, I've been eating better. I've learned new things. Like I can now make eggs pretty much any way you could imagine. If it can be done with an egg, I can do it. And that's been a lot of fun.
Well, I know when I was at home, I had never in my life watched a bird build a nest from like the first
Oh,
little twig. And I just happened to have my office, my kind of pop-up office that I had in my basement. And I was able to look out the window every day. And I'm like, what's that bird doing up there? And I watched that whole nest form.
oh,
I
cool.
watched, the babies hatch, from the
Yep.
eggs. Like it was just like really getting back to realizing that many, many times we're trapped in spaces and we're heads down without a lot of
Yeah.
windows, and life is going on around us. We just don't take the time to appreciate it.
Oh, isn't that a forest for the trees moment? Like you actually got to see the nest, the
Yep.
babies. Wow.
And now
Oh,
they're
that's
all gone,
cool.
and I feel really sad. But
They've left the nest.
yes, hopefully. I always
Yeah.
was a little worried about the predators that were hanging
Yeah,
around, but
right.
that's what I know. I'm probably too in. That was probably the time I thought, well, maybe it's time to
Too
go back to
invested.
Collider. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so we're on sort of the downhill slide here for this
Heck
session.
yeah.
So besides getting in touch with your inner Julia child,
Hmm.
what's one thing that people may not know about you?
Oh. Well, in totally random fact, I collect fountain pens.
Ooh,
Semi-recent thing, like over the, I don't know, the last 2 years or so. Yeah. So like expensive pens to write stuff with. And it sort of was a reaction to we're always on our computers, everything's electronic. You go into meetings and 5 laptops are out, and people they're paying attention, they're engaged, they're taking notes. But it always felt disconnected. Um, so yeah, randomly got into fine German fountain pens.
that's cool. That's that was one of those things that I always thought I would be doing. And that and watches, like really
Right?
awesome watches. There's so I was assuming it's the same thing with fountain pens. There's just this sort of subculture of
Oh yeah.
fanatical, you know, people that just are in love with this stuff. So I
Oh
love when
yeah.
people have those sort of hobbies because
Yep.
they really do mean a lot, and they're such a unique way to sort of keep yourself centered, that I
Yeah.
think that's really awesome. That's cool.
Yeah. And it's fun with like, there's a lot of technology in it, even though it's a very, it's hundreds of years old. There's a lot of artistry in it. And then there is a bit of a connection. Like I write, if I do a meeting, I'm always taking notes. I never reference notes, but the act of like writing the note down makes it easier to then recall the information in the future. And when you have a good pen, it's kind of a nicer experience with it. And it's very much like the watch stuff. Thankfully, less expensive than getting into
Yeah.
watch collecting. But same idea, like the technology, the artistry, the connection to something that's both old and very modern at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. Although
Yeah.
I've seen some pens in airports where I'm like, I don't know, airports and a few other places. I was really some fine shops in bigger cities. I was like,
Yep.
boom, like that is insane. I would never spend money on that. And
Oh
but
yeah. There
to the right
there are
person,
pens.
that's yeah.
Yeah, there are pens that you can spend $7, 8, $9,000 on without blinking.
And I always say you can't say Collider and you can't say me, but who is doing great work right now to support entrepreneurs in the state, but maybe people don't know a lot about them or don't know they're doing that work?
Oh, I'm trying to think. There's so many that are doing good work. I'm trying to think who's like under profiled or underappreciated. All right. two that come to mind. Mary Mccarthy, who works at the University of Minnesota Tech Transfer Office. She's an entrepreneur. She worked at Medtronic for a long time, now in tech transfer, and she just grinds. Like, she's everywhere. She's making connections. Tech transfer is hard. Yeah, she does fantastic work, and is just a wonderful person to begin with.
Yep.
And then the other she's a little bit higher profile, but I think doesn't get the attention she deserves. Diane Rucker with University Enterprise Labs. It's been, I don't know, a year and a half since she came in, doubled the number of companies that are in the space, repositioning it from being purely about real estate and like a place to hang your hat to part of the broader ecosystem. And she thinks about things just in a way that I've not seen other people think about things. Like, every problem she approaches from a different angle than what I would approach it. So I find every time I have a conversation with her, I come away thinking about my challenges very differently. And I appreciate that. Like, it keeps me out of my own head. So yeah, Mary and Diane, I think, are doing fantastic work.
Awesome. Yeah. I love hearing about people that I personally know both of them, but it's partially, I always ask because it's great to give them some recognition, but selfishly, that increases the guest list for my podcast going forward. So
they
I always
be
like
great, yeah.
Good referrals. Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. So as we close out here, where can people get in contact with you if they want to learn more, or they want to ask some questions or learn more about Medical Alley?
Yeah. So a couple of places. So if you want to learn more about Medical Alley, medicalalley, ALLEY.org is their website. If you want to track me down, probably easiest, look me up on Twitter, Frank Med Alley, or on LinkedIn, just look up my name. Or my email is just first initial, last name at medicalalley.org. I'm always happy to chat with anyone about pretty much anything, because you never know where it'll end up going.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for taking the time today to share your story. And thanks for just being a true champion for Minnesota entrepreneurship.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.